I want to welcome everyone to the final session of the Arrow Rock Birds and Bees Festival of 2021. My name is Dana Ripper. I'm the co-founder of the Missouri River Bird Observatory. We are a nonprofit organization dedicated to the conservation of birds and their habitats, and we're based in lovely Arrow Rock, Missouri. So this is really the Arrow Rock Birds and Bees Festival. We started the festival in 2019 in partnership with Experience Arrow Rock, and we had a big street festival with a lot of educational booths that was in conjunction with the Arrow Rock Garden Market, which has been going on for almost 20 years now. And so, like many things in 2020, that whole thing was canceled. And this year we came back with this hybrid format. So folks have been joining us for various talks for the last 3 days. And today we actually had a small in-person event in Arrow Rock as well, again, in partnership with Experience Arrow Rock. And for the birds and bees part of the festival, we had 7 different guided nature hikes. And I want to give a big thank you. If any of you folks are on here that were trip leaders today, thank you so much for bringing us your time and expertise to lead those trips. So I also want to acknowledge the Missouri River Bird Observatory staff and board. We're a fairly small, but I think pretty effective organization, and it took all of us chipping in to get this festival rolled out this year. So I thank you all and I appreciate you all. I also want to point out, I know some people are joining us. They've been with us all week, but some people are going to be new tonight. So I do want to give another shout out to our sponsors, to the organizations and individuals and families that sponsored the Birds and Bees Festival this year. Also our exhibitors. So all of you that have been watching things virtually all week and have the Whova platform, our exhibitors, I hope you got a chance to visit them. But if you didn't, you actually have access for the next 3 months, I confirmed today. So there's handouts and videos all throughout the platform, a lot of really awesome educational material and informative videos that you can watch. So please try and check those out. One of those exhibitors, and I was reminded of this when my friend Edgewade gave a presentation about field guides yesterday. It's really good to support your local bookstores. One of our exhibitors is Left Bank Books out of St. Louis. And they hold all of Dr. Tallamy's books. And so particularly if you're in the St. Louis area, try and support your small local stores. And I know that a lot of bird stores and nature stores across the state do sell Dr. Tallamy's books. So just want to encourage you to try and get them locally instead of just ordering them online. So we have had more than 25 speakers this week. They have given us their time and expertise, and I'm very, very grateful to them. They came from, all across Missouri and all around the country to deliver these really, really informative virtual sessions. I learned a ton this week, and just want to point out that all of the Birds and Bees Festival folks, you will have access to all of the recordings. So if you missed things, we'd love for you to go ahead and go back and look at them. I also want to welcome the Missouri Birding Society members that are on with us tonight. I have the honor of being the current president of the Missouri Birding Society, and this is part of our spring meeting as well. So welcome to this keynote. I'm excited to have everyone here. And speaking of awesome speakers, the gentleman that's speaking to us tonight is well known to many of us, but Doug Tallamy is the T.A. Baker Professor of Agriculture in the Department of Entomology and Wildlife Ecology at the University of Delaware, where he has authored 104 research publications and has taught insect-related courses for over 40 years. Chief among his research goals is to better understand the many ways insects interact with plants and how such interactions determine the diversity of animal communities. His book, Bringing Nature Home, was published by Timber Press in 2007, and I don't think that I'm speculating by saying that that's a book that changed life for many of us. It was awarded the 2008 silver medal by the Garden Writers Association. The Living Landscape, co-authored with Rick Dark, was published in 2014. Nature's Best Hope, a New York Times bestseller, was released in February 2020. And his latest book, The Nature of Oaks, was released by Timber Press in March of this year. Among Dr. Tallamy's awards are the Garden Club of America Margaret Douglas Medal for Conservation and the Tom Dodd Jr. Award of Excellence, the 2018 AHS B.Y. Morrison Communication Award, and the 2019 Cynthia Westcott Scientific Writing Award. And so it is my great privilege to introduce Doug Tallamy. Please, sir.
Thank you, Dana. Well, it's a pleasure to be here tonight. I want to talk to you about my idea of what nature's best hope is. But before I do that, I'm going to return to what happened in 2019, at least in the East. I think it reached all the way to Missouri, but we had what we know as an oak mast in the red oak group. All the members of the red oak group got together and decided to make their acorns at the same time. And this is what it looked like in a lot of places. Well, I'm easily entertained, so I took one of those acorns and I just stared at it, and I was rewarded because an insect started to chew its way out of the acorn, and I find that very exciting. First, it chewed a hole, forced its head through the hole, then it forced its entire body through that hole. It was a tight squeeze, looked like the Pillsbury Doughboy, finally plopped down. It's a very dangerous time for this insect larva because it is good to eat. A lot of things are after it. So it gets to safety by wiggling and squirming beneath the surface of the soil in about 30 seconds. And once it's underground, it stretches in all directions and forms an underground chamber. And within that chamber, it converts itself to a pupa and stays there for 2 years. After 2 years, comes out as an acorn weevil. This is what an acorn weevil looks like. A lot of people think weevils have big noses because it looks like they do, but that's actually an extension of the head capsule, and the mouth parts are way down here. And they take those mouth parts and chew a hole down into the center of the acorn, turn around and lay an egg in it, and that's how the larva gets into the acorn. You might wonder why they spend 2 years underground. Why don't they come out the next year like most insects? It's because it takes red oak acorns 18 months to complete their development. And if they came out the next year, there wouldn't be enough acorns for them. Well, once they're out, of course, that leaves a hole in the acorn, a true vacuum. And nature abhors a vacuum. In this case, she has filled it with 3 species of temnothorax ants. Tiny little ants for the entire colony lives in the vacated holes made by acorn weevils. And if they find a new acorn, they're excited because their old acorn's falling apart. So they tell everybody it is time to move. They grab the larvae, they grab the eggs, and in about 30 minutes, they have moved the entire colony into their new house. They post a guard here to make sure nobody else comes in, and that's where they're going to live for the next 2 years. I gave this talk to my wife when I first put it together, and she said, well, what's your point? What are you trying to tell us? She said it nicely. My point is that's just one of literally millions of very specialized interactions that comprise much of nature. The interactions are mostly between animals and plants. Like this one, this is the relationship between jays and oaks. Jays are the primary disperser of oak acorns. A single jay can bury up to 4,500 acorns in a fall. The object is to go get those acorns during the wintertime and have something to eat, but they only remember where about 1/4 of them are. So they actually have planted about 3,000 oak trees every single year. They are the primary dispersers of oak acorns. Found out this year what is pollinating witch hazel. It's another specialized interaction. Witch hazel, of course, blooms very late in the fall. Well, it turns out there are a group of moths called winter moths. This is the bicolored sallow, one of them, that fly very late. And they turn out to be the primary pollinators of witch hazel. I don't know whether witch hazel is blooming late to take advantage of winter moths or whether winter moths are flying late to take advantage of witch hazel, but they are taking advantage of each other right now. The specialized relationship between pileated woodpeckers and carpenter ants. Carpenter ants are the primary food of the young. Pileated, that's what they feed their young on. And of course, you won't have carpenter ants unless you have the large trees that make those carpenter ants. You won't have this bee, Andrena facilii, unless you have Phacelia. That is the only pollen that particular bee can rear its young on. And it turns out that pollen specialization is very common in our native bees. We have over 4,000 species of native bees, and at least a third of them are highly specialized. They can only reproduce on the pollen of particular plants. So in the Midwest, at least 13 species of bees can only reproduce on the pollen of perennial sunflowers. You won't have Baltimore checker spot unless you have white turtlehead. I could talk about nature's specialized relationships all night long. But today, these relationships, nature itself, is on the ropes. And it's on the ropes because we didn't take Teddy Roosevelt's advice. Way back in 1908, Teddy heard that the state of Arizona was going to mine the Grand Canyon. So he went to the canyon, stood on the edge, looked out over the edge, and he said, "Leave it as it is." And with those 5 words, he started the process of creating the Grand Canyon National Park. Well, we didn't leave it as it was. There's only about 5% of the lower 48 states that's anything close to its original pristine ecological condition. And that's because we've logged the country repeatedly. We have tilled it. We have drained it. We've grazed it. We've got 770 million acres of rangeland, which is 4.5 times the size of Texas. And of course, we've paved it and otherwise developed it. We've straightened our rivers and dammed them, and you can spell that any way you want. We have polluted our skies and changed our climate for centuries to come. We've drained our aquifers. We've introduced more than 3,300 species of plants from other continents, many of which are running amok in our natural areas. In short, we've carved up those natural areas into tiny remnants of their former selves. And each one of those remnants is too small and too isolated to sustain the species that run the ecosystems that we all depend on. Why have we done that? Well, I imagine we thought the Earth, our nest, was so big that we could foul it forever and there wouldn't be any consequences. Of course, we were wrong about that, and that's why we're seeing headlines like this, pretty scary headlines. The insect apocalypse is here. What does it mean for the rest of life on Earth? Talking about global insect decline. Followed by this one, North America's lost 3 billion breeding birds in the last 50 years. That's almost a third of our North American bird population gone. Now the UN says, well, we're going to lose 1 million species to extinction, probably in the next 20 years. And I love the way they report this as if it's just another headline. They might as well say, we're going to lose oxygen in the next 20 years and then go on to the next headline. This is not an option, folks. We can't lose the natural systems that support us unless we want to be lost ourselves. Well, I could go on talking about the pox that we humans have delivered upon the environment, thus upon all of our houses. But that's not what this talk is about. This talk is about a cure for that pox. It's a cure that'll take small efforts from lots of people, but those efforts will deliver enormous physical, psychological, and environmental benefits to everybody. Let's return to this headline briefly. The insect apocalypse is here. What does it mean for the rest of life on Earth? Well, the great E.O. Wilson, the most famous entomologist of all times, Harvard emeritus, he's 92, he still writes a book every year. He told us what it would mean if we were to lose our insects, and he did it way back in 1987 with this paper, The Little Things That Run the World. His message was very clear. Life as we know it depends on insects. And if they were to disappear, so would most of our flowering plants. And if most of our flowering plants disappeared, that would so drastically change energy flow through our terrestrial habitats that the food webs that support our animals, the amphibians, the reptiles, the birds, the mammals, even many of our freshwater fish, those food webs would collapse and those animals would disappear. The biosphere, the living portion of the Earth, would rot because we would have lost insect decomposers that rapidly turn over nutrients, and all we would have is bacteria and fungi. And of course, humans would not survive any of those drastic changes. The good news is that that doesn't have to happen. We can save our insects, we can save our birds, we can save nature itself, but we're going to have to change the way we landscape to do it. Why is that? Well, remember, humans are products of nature. We are totally dependent on nature. We're totally dependent on what we call ecosystem services. Now, these are deliverables produced by healthy ecosystems, not just to humans, but to everything that's out there, like the production of oxygen. That's what plants give us, pretty important. Plants also clean water. They slow its journey to the sea where it becomes too salty to use. Plants are capturing carbon, enormously important today, pulling carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, out of harm's way, taking the molecule from the carbon molecule from carbon dioxide and building their tissues with it, and then pumping the extra carbon into the ground. That's the long-term solution right there. Plants pump carbon into the ground through their roots, and that's why the soil is brown or black, where it can be stably stored for thousands of years. They're also building topsoil, holding it in place. They're preventing floods. They're dampening severe weather. Plants convert sunlight into food. If we lose our plants, we're going to have to eat sunlight. I wish us luck. What do animals do for plants? Well, they provide pest control services. They pollinate nearly 90% of those of flowering plants. They disperse plant seeds and other important things. So designing landscapes like this that destroy the production of ecosystem services is just not a good idea. Never was a good idea, but these days we've got 7.8, 7.9 billion people on the planet. We need more ecosystem services today than ever before. Taking huge portions of the planet out of production so that we can have status symbols is just not a good idea. Now, there have been visionaries through the ages who have recognized that we humans needed to work on our relationship with planet Earth. Aldo Leopold was one of the most eloquent. He wrote extensively in the first half of the 1900s. And one of the things he said is the oldest task in human history is to live in a piece of land without spoiling it. Now, there have been indigenous groups that have been good at doing that for long periods, but our huge Western societies and our huge Asian societies are terrible at doing that. We habitually take more from the land than it has to offer, completely ruining it, then moving to another place doing the same thing. Clearly not sustainable behavior. So Aldo had an idea that we were actually capable of developing what he called a land ethic. He knew we had to use the earth, we had to farm, lumber, graze, mine, do all of those things. But he believed that we could learn to do them gently enough that we did not destroy local ecosystems. And that's what he called a land ethic. It's really just about caring about the land that we're using. And he wrote about that in the Sand County Almanac. What he didn't talk about was developing a land ethic where we actually lived. And I'm not sure why that was, but I suspect the notion that humans and nature cannot coexist in the same place at the same time. That notion was so deeply embedded in the culture of Aldo Leopold's day, still embedded in our own culture, that he may not have even recognized it as an option. What I want to argue tonight, though, is that living with nature not only is an option, it's the only viable option that's left to us. You know, in the past, conservationists worked exclusively where there weren't a lot of people. We now need to turn that on its head. We need to save nature, actually reconstruct it where there are a lot of people, because that's most everywhere. In other words, we have to find ways for nature to thrive in human-dominated landscapes, not hang on by a thread, not disappear bit by bit, but thrive. Where should we start? Well, let's go back to private property. We can't ignore private property. We have to do conservation on private property because most of the land is privately owned. 85.6% of the U.S. east of the Mississippi is privately owned. 78% of the entire country is privately owned. If we don't do conservation on private property, we're going to fail because we won't be working in areas that are large enough or connected enough to sustain the ecosystems that we require. There are a number of conservation options, though, that we're not taking advantage of very well right now. How about power and pipeline rights-of-ways? 21 million acres in those types of landscapes. Railroad rights-of-ways, another 3 million acres. Golf courses, 2 million acres. Airports, 3 million acres. You know, the Denver airport is twice the size of Manhattan. These are big places. Roadside, 17 million acres. And then all the places we live. In rural areas, exurbia, suburbia, urban centers, hundreds of millions of acres in those types of landscapes. So if you add up these, and you can think of others, that's 599 million acres, where we could be doing conservation where we're really not right now. How big is 599 million acres? It's big. It's bigger than Vermont, plus New Jersey, plus Maine, Virginia, New York, Georgia, Florida, Oklahoma, plus Montana, California, and Texas. Add all those together. Not having a place to do conservation is not the issue. We can do conservation just about anywhere. And when I talk about conservation, I'm not being accurate. I'm not talking about conserving parts of nature that still exist. I'm talking about rebuilding it. And it's not truly restoration either, because people will say, well, you're not restoring exactly what was there. That's true. We're not. But we can unite enough of those specialized interactions so that you have functional ecosystems, even if it's not exactly what was there before humans came and disrupted it. But in order to put nature back together again, we have to start with the building blocks. Not all species contribute to ecosystem function equally. So we have to start with the most important groups, and the others can join later. The flowering plants are, we must have flowering plants because they're capturing the bulk of the energy from the sun, turning it into food, storing it in their leaves. And of course, in order to have flowering plants, you have to have the pollinators that allow those plants to reproduce. That's one group that we need. So now we've got the energy from the sun stored as food in the leaves of plants. We have to get it to animals. Most vertebrates don't eat plants directly. They eat something that ate plants. That something is typically insects. But out of all the insects eating plants, it's caterpillars that are transferring more energy from plants to other animals than any other type of plant eater. So designing landscapes that don't have a lot of caterpillars means you're going to have a dead-end food web. Most of the energy will remain locked up in the plant leaves. Let me give you an example using the Carolina chickadee. It is it's like all the chickadees around the country. Eats seeds during the wintertime. 50% of its diet is seeds. That's why it's one of the main birds at our bird feeder. But when it comes time to rear their young, their babies can't eat seeds. Like most birds, their babies cannot eat seeds, so they have to switch to insects. And if they're in a healthy environment, they will rear their young almost entirely on caterpillars. And they're not exceptions. 96% of our terrestrial birds rear their young on insects, and most of those insects are caterpillars. How do I know that? Well, there's a number of lines of evidence that suggest that, but here's a citizen science project that one of my PhD students did a few years ago, Ashley Kennedy. She put out a call to bird photographers. It was, use citizen science. Bird photographers around the country, asking them to take pictures of birds during the breeding season. It's focusing mainly on taking pictures of birds that were carrying food to the nest. They were going to send those pictures to Ashley, and she was going to identify what the prey items in the beaks of the birds were, and reconstruct the nestling diets of as many birds in North America as possible. It was successful. She got thousands of pictures from all over the country, and she was able to put together the nestling diet of 20 of the common bird families, and that's what you're looking at here. The green bars are the percentage of those diets that were caterpillars, and in 16 out of the 20 common bird families, caterpillars dominated the diet. So again, imagine what would happen if we built landscapes that did not have enough caterpillars. Most of our birds would not be able to reproduce. So there's something seems to be special about caterpillars. What is it? There's actually several things that are special about caterpillars. And one of them is caterpillars are soft. Think of this guy as if he's a little sausage with a very thin wrapper. The thin wrapper is exoskeleton made of chitin. It's undigestible. And birds don't want a lot of undigestible stuff. So, and the fact that caterpillars are soft means you can stuff it down the throat of your offspring without fear of injuring it. If you've ever watched a parent bird rear their young, they're pretty rough. Their beak is like a plunger. They just stuff it down there. Caterpillars are also relatively large prey items. One medium-sized caterpillar is equal to the biomass of 200 aphids. Now, some of our smaller birds do chase aphids around, but do you want to chase 200 aphids or get one caterpillar? They're nutritious. They're very high in fat, very high in protein, low percentage of chitin compared to most other insects. Particularly beetles. Beetles are not like little sausages. They're like little tanks. Much of a beetle is undigestible, and a lot of beetles have sharp edges. And finally, it turns out that caterpillars are the best source of carotenoids for birds during the breeding season. Now, I mentioned carotenoids not because I love organic chemistry, but because I'm a vertebrate, and you're a vertebrate, and birds are vertebrates. And we vertebrates cannot make our own carotenoids. We have to get them from plants. Only plants make carotenoids, and we have to get them from plants because carotenoids are essential components of vertebrate diets. And that's why my wife Cindy makes sure I have lots of carrots to get my beta carotene, and lots of tomatoes to get my lycopene, lots of whatever that is to get my lutein. Had some of that tonight, whatever it was. And when I eat those things, it stimulates my immune system. I can't think of a better time to have a very strong immune system. Carotenoids are also antioxidants. They run around our body, protect our DNA from oxidative damage. They improve color vision. When your mother said, eat your carrots, you will see better, she was right. She didn't know she was right, but it turns out she was right. Carotenoids improve sperm vitality. They improve sexual attractiveness. Now we're talking about things like this male prothonotary warbler, who is bright yellow because he's had access to lots of luteins. He takes his luteins, makes pigments out of them, puts them in his feathers, and the brighter yellow he is, the more ladies he attracts. Well, where are they getting their carotenoids from? From their diet, of course, but carotenoids are not equally distributed among invertebrate prey items. The first two bars here are types of caterpillars, and they have far more carotenoids than other types of insects. Here are the adult caterpillars down here, the moths and butterflies themselves, far fewer carotenoids because they're not eating green leaves. Here's the earthworm way over here. So the early bird gets the worm, but he doesn't get any carotenoids when he gets the worm. So this and other studies are suggesting very convincingly that caterpillars are not optional parts of bird diets. It seems they're essential parts of bird diets. So let's just say birds need caterpillars. The next question is, how many caterpillars do they need? Is 1 or 2 enough, or 1 or 2 a day enough? Well, that's a good question. Let's go back to chickadees and ask that question, because there are a lot of data with chickadees. How many caterpillars does it take to make a clutch of chickadees? 1 or 2 is not enough. It takes thousands, 6,000 to 9,000 caterpillars to get 1 clutch of chickadees to the point where they leave the nest, depending on the number of chicks in the nest. And after they leave the nest, the parents continue to feed them caterpillars for another 21 days, but they're flying all around, so nobody's been able to count those. So you're really talking about tens of thousands of caterpillars to get one group of baby chickadees, that's 1/3 of an ounce of a bird, through to maturity. And if you want chickadees to breed in your yard, to reproduce in your yard, and I would think you would want to, because that's pretty much all that's left in an awful lot of places. You need to have all those caterpillars in your yard, because chickadees are foraging only about 50 meters from the nest. They're not flying 5 miles down the road to the nearest woodlot. And if you don't landscape in a way that has all those caterpillars, that's called insect decline. And it really looks like that's one of the factors causing bird declines. We went to the original data set from Rosenberg et al. In 2019. That's the group that says we lost 3 billion breeding birds in North America in the last 50 years. We divided the terrestrial bird species up into 2 groups, the species that require insects at some part of their life history and the species that do not. So things like doves and finches, they can reproduce on seeds. They don't need insects. They didn't lose any numbers in the last 50 years. But the insects that require, or the birds that require insects, lost on average 10 million individuals per species. This doesn't prove cause and effect, but it certainly suggests that as insects go, so go our birds. And it's really not a big leap of faith to see what we're talking about here. If you take away the bird food, the birds aren't going to do really well. So if we want birds in our landscapes, we're going to have to start landscaping in a way that supplies the food. And it's not just birds. I'm using birds as a model system. A lot of things require insects, particularly caterpillars. So how do we landscape for caterpillars? I recognize, by the way, that this is a new goal for landscaping. In the past, we have landscaped exclusively for aesthetics. We thought plants were just decorations, and it didn't matter what they did as long as they looked nice. And that's the primary reason we brought in all these non-native plants from all over the world, because they were pretty. But we still want pretty landscapes, but they're also going to have to support insects now. So how do we put those insects back? Well, you add particularly caterpillars to landscapes by adding the plants that support them. That makes sense. There is a catch, though, and that is that most plants don't support a lot of caterpillars. So we have to be fussy about it when we're choosing our plants. And we have to be fussy because the caterpillars themselves are fussy. They don't eat any old plant, and the monarch butterfly illustrates it perfectly. If you want monarch butterflies to develop on your landscape, not just fly by, you can have all the crepe myrtles and all the calorie pears and all the barberry and all the burning bush and all the hostas and all the Chinese ornamental plants that we typically landscape with, and you won't make a single monarch butterfly. The only thing that's going to create new monarch butterflies is milkweed. That's called host plant specialization, and it turns out that most of the insects that eat plants are host plant specialists. Why is that? Because plants have made them that way. Plants don't want to be eaten. They want to capture the energy from the sun and use it for their own growth and reproduction. So they loaded their leaves with nasty tasting chemicals, secondary metabolic compounds that make those leaves either bitter or downright toxic. And it's a really effective defense that keeps most of the insects of the world from eating most of the plants of the world. And that's why it's green out there in the summertime. It's not because there are no insects out there that want to eat those plants. It's because most of the insects that are out there cannot eat most of the plants. They are too well protected. But we do know that insects eat plants. So how do they do that? How do they get around those chemical defenses? Well, this is where the specialization comes in. 90% of the insects that eat plants are host plant specialists. Every plant lineage that's out there protects itself with a unique cocktail of chemical defenses. And no one insect can adapt to all of them. So they pick one or two lineages that are really similar in their defenses. And the insects adapt to those. They get really good at circumventing those particular defenses. They develop the enzymes that store and excrete and detoxify those compounds, the behavioral adaptations, the life history adaptations that minimize the insect's exposure to those compounds. But it takes a long period of evolutionary history for all those adaptations to fall into place. It doesn't happen overnight. And once they do fall into place, the insect's locked into eating those particular plants. So the monarch has adapted to milkweeds, which are toxic plants, by the way, really successfully. But in doing that, they haven't adapted to oaks or cucurbits or lilacs or anything else. So when we take those plants, when we take the milkweeds away and replace them with plants, particularly from other continents, of course our monarch can't eat it. You know, plants from another continent haven't been here long enough for our insects to adapt to them. So all I'm trying to say here is that plant choice matters. When we're trying to reconstruct food webs that support the life around us, we have to choose the right plants or it's not going to work. And I'm going to give you 3 examples of how well it does work when we do choose the right plants, starting with my house right here in Oxford, Pennsylvania. I'm sitting in that window right there. This is the house. There was a very old farm for about 300 years. It was broken up a few years ago, and we bought a 10-acre lot. And this is what it looked like when we moved in. The last thing they did on this exhausted farm was to mow it for hay. And when you're mowing around here, you're really mowing all the rootstocks of all the invasive plants from Asia. Multiflora rose and Oriental bittersweet and Japanese honeysuckle and bush honeysuckle and miscanthus and porcelain berry and burning bush, and you know what it's like. So they mow that and they call that hay, which when we started to build the house, of course, they stopped mowing, and those are the plants that came back. The 10 acres were totally choked with invasive plants. This is my wife, Cindy, getting ready to clear the 10 acres. And I show you this just to convince you that it can be done. And it can be done by one person. She did it largely by herself. It is a lot of work. There is no doubt. And as long as your neighbors are all still contributing invasive seeds to you, it's work that never ends. You have to keep at it. Fortunately, she enjoys doing it. What was I doing while she was clearing the land? I was telling her she was doing a great job. But I also it was my job to put the plants back. The object was to rebuild the biodiversity on our 10 acres. And the only way you're going to do that is to recreate the food web using the caterpillars that support that food web. So this is one of the things I tried early on, was to try to get the Canadian owlet at our yard. I'd never even seen a Canadian owlet. That's what they look like. This is what the adult looks like, just like a leaf. Well, you're not going to have Canadian owlets unless you have meadowrue. That is the only plant that they will develop on. Just like monarchs, they are host plant specialists. And of course, we didn't have any meadowrue. I'm sure it grew here hundreds of years ago, but it was farmed out long ago. So I got some meadowrue seeds from someplace and planted them. They grew very nicely. But, you know, I actually had very little faith that Canadian owlets would be able to find my meadowrue. Or maybe it would take them years. So I didn't even go out and look at my meadowrue plants for about 2 months after I planted them. But when I did walk by accidentally, they were covered with Canadian owlets. It was a big and rapid success. And today we have a good population of meadowrue and Canadian owlets. So there we go. I've added 2 species to the property. Same story with the goldenrod stowaway. That's a misnomer for this beautiful moth. It has nothing to do with goldenrod. It's a specialist on this plant, Bidens aristosa. I did know it's called ditch daisy. I know there were some Bidens in a power line cut about 14 miles away. So I got some seeds, planted them at home. They grew very nicely. It took about a year for the goldenrod stowaway to find my Bidens, but it did, and now we've got a good population of both of these. And now we've added 4 species to the property. Wanted the hackberry emperor. Not because it's the most beautiful butterfly, but because it's a butterfly that belongs here. Well, as its name suggests, it's a specialist on hackberry, and we didn't have any hackberry. So I planted hackberry. It took 4 years for the butterflies to find my hackberry, but they did, and walked by one of my hackberry trees last June. There were 9 hackberry emperor caterpillars on a single branch. So another big success. Now we've added 6 species to the property. I did not plant goldenrod. It came in on its own, and along with it came many of the things that eat goldenrod, like the beautiful brown hooded owlet, the Arcigera flower moth, the goldenrod leaf miner, the distinct Sparaginothus, the goldenrod gall moth. Now this is one that hasn't come, the goldenrod flower moth. I'm not sure why it hasn't come. It actually likes goldenrod that blooms very early. My goldenrod never blooms early because the deer eat it so often. So this guy isn't here yet, but one of these days he's going to make it. That's what his caterpillars look like. This is part of the fun, though. This is anticipation. Every year, it's like waiting for the ketchup to come out of the bottle. Every year, I go out, I look for the goldenrod flower moth. One of these years, I'm going to find it, and that will be a great day. Planted Virginia creeper. Yes, Virginia creeper. People tell me they don't like Virginia creeper, but I don't know why. Maybe because the word creeper's in there. It's a great native plant. It can climb our trees without girdling them, without hurting them, without pulling them down. Makes nutritious berries for the birds in the fall. It's a great pollinator plant, believe it or not. Its flowers are not big and showy, which is why we tend to ignore it, but the bees love it. You know, if you're making a pollinator garden, don't think like a human. Think like a bee. You're putting in flowers that have a lot of nectar and pollen, whether or not they are pretty for humans. It's got great fall color. It's a good ground cover, and it's the major host plant for the large sphinx moths that are the primary part of cardinal diets. Things like the Pandora sphinx and its beautiful adult, the lettered sphinx, the hog sphinx, the abbot sphinx, all on Virginia creeper. Wanted the double-toothed prominent caterpillar because it's such a cool looking caterpillar. I mean, who wouldn't want that? It's a specialist on elm, and we didn't have any elm. I got some elm seeds from the University of Delaware gutter. You know, they got some big elms that never died. And every year, right about now, they dropped their seeds, scooped them up, planted them at home. They grew really nicely. You know, in six days, they germinate. And 19 years later, they're 80 feet tall. Big success. Caterpillar came right away, American elm. Wanted the evening primrose moth because it's beautiful. I like beauty like anybody else. Well, we didn't have any evening primrose, so I planted it, Enithera. The moth came and it spends the day with its head stuffed in the flowers. It's very cute. And I planted a lot of oaks. Now, these are just examples of the plants we put back on our property. I want to focus on oaks for a while because they're such important plants. This is the Bedford oak in Bedford, New York. People argue about whether it's 400 years old or 500 years old. It's enormous. And I hear people say, well, you know, I don't want to plant an oak because I won't live long enough to enjoy it. And if your oak has to be 400 years old before you can enjoy it, you're right, you won't. But if you enjoy what the oak delivers to your yard, to your little ecosystem, you can enjoy it right away. And I can say that with confidence because I planted most of my oaks as acorns or 2-foot bare root whips. Acorns free, by the way. 2-foot bare root whips, $1.50 each. And right away, they started to rebuild that food web that is driven by the caterpillars of the moths that eat oaks. Things like the solitary oak leaf miner, the Juvenile's dusky wing, the yellow-shouldered moth, the orange-headed epicalema, the red-washed caterpillar, the yellow-vested moth, the orange-tufted oneida, the spiny oak caterpillar, the two-spotted oak punky, the variable oak leaf caterpillar, the red-humped oak worm, the orange-humped oak worm, the pink-striped oak worm, the pleasant dagger moth, the delightful dagger moth, the lesser oak dagger moth, the greater oak dagger moth, the streaked dagger moth, the afflicted dagger moth, the crown bucolatrix, the white blotch heterocampa, the oblique heterocampa, the red line panapoda, the laugher, and literally hundreds more species of moths have come to the oaks on our property, and they come right away. Here is a pin oak that has just popped its head above the leaves, and here's a caterpillar standing on the ground eating the leaves of that oak. You don't have to wait hundreds of years for your oaks to start to contribute to your food web. This is what our yard looks like now. I'm still sitting in that window right now. We've got lawn. We're very traditional here, but I put a lot of plants back. And every time I put a new plant lineage at our house, there's a good chance that I will attract the moths that are specialized on that lineage, because they're the central focus of the biodiversity of the food web that supports everything at our house. I made a decision to start to count all the species of moths that have come to our house by taking a picture of them. I started 4 years ago. I'm still at it, and I'm up to 1,052 species of moths that I have photographed at our house. Now, we've got 10 acres. Pennsylvania is 2.4 million acres. So in 1/240,000th of the landmass of Pennsylvania, we've got 40% of all the moths that occur in Pennsylvania. And because so many of these species of moths are bird food, we've recorded 59 species of birds that have bred on our 10 acres of terrestrial birds, which is 38% of all the terrestrial birds that occur in Pennsylvania. They bred here. They didn't just fly by. Why is that important? Well, I saw this headline this past fall too. 2/3 of World Wildlife Fund says that 2/3 of the wildlife on planet Earth have disappeared since 1970. And they say they vanish, like poof, they're gone. We've killed them. We have killed 2/3 of the wildlife on planet Earth since 1970. But I'm thinking, not at our house. I am sure that we have increased biodiversity by at least 2/3 at our house. And it didn't take that long. And we did it simply by putting the plants back, putting the plants that drive the food webs. It's something everybody can do. We don't have to accept these frightening headlines as inevitable. They're not inevitable. We can turn it around. But I know what you're thinking. We own 10 acres, and a lot of people in suburbia and cities do not. Will it work on smaller properties? Well, that's a good question. Let's go to Margie and Dan Terpster's house in Kirkwood, Missouri. You know Kirkwood, Missouri. They have 0.6 acres. That's 18 times less land than Cindy and I have. And the major invasive plant in Kirkwood, Missouri is bush honeysuckle, Amur honeysuckle. They got rid of that. They also live in the middle of suburbia. They're surrounded by people with the big lawns. So they got rid of their invasive plants. They planted a lot of native plants, put in a water feature they call a bubbler, and then they sat back and started to count the birds that have used their yard. And they're up to 149 bird species that have used their yard. They're 0.6 acres, plus 35 warbler species. Just to put that in perspective, we've only recorded 8 warbler species at our house. So yes, it works on smaller properties. What about city yards, urban yards? Let's go to Pam Carlson's house in Chicago. And I mean in Chicago. Right on the other side of this wall here is one of the runways of O'Hare Airport. Right over here is Kennedy Expressway. Pam has 1/10 of an acre. That's 3 times smaller than the average lot size in North America. It's a pretty 1/10, but it is not connected to any natural area at all. So it's a little isolated island. Well, she did the same thing. She got rid of her invasive plants, planted 60 species of native plants, put in a little water feature for the birds. And then she sat back and started to count the birds. And she is, that's old. She's up to 119 species of birds that have used her yard, including a woodcock. There's Pam's woodcock. So if you haven't seen a woodcock lately, go to Chicago and check it out at Pam's house. What about city centers, though? 82% of us are said to live in cities now in North America. Are they going to all miss out on this fun? Well, in 2014, I was staring at this plant, Asclepias tuberosa. People call it butterfly weed, which reminds me, we have a marketing issue with our native plants. We call them weeds. I wonder why people don't plant them. So let's not call this butterfly weed. Let's call it Monarch's Delight. Okay, I was staring at Monarch's Delight 2014. The first thing I saw were 2 species of leafcutter bee, Megachile bee, and one of them I'd never seen before. There's a big one and a little one. I know they're leafcutters because they carry their pollen on their tummy and not on their legs. Well, leafcutter bees have very strict requirements. Not only do they need pollen and nectar, but they also need soft leaves. Leaves of red bud are perfect because they cut the edges of those leaves out, make little semicircles like that, roll that up, and stuff it full of pollen, and then lay an egg on it, and then fold it all up. And then they stuff the whole thing into a crack or a crevice. Well, there was a red bud growing right next to the Monarch's Delight, so the leafcutter bees had everything they needed. No wonder they were there. And because there was a red bud there, I'm pretty sure that's why there were bumblebees there as well. Remember, bumblebees overwinter queens. The colony has died off in the fall. So when they come out in the spring, they're alone. They've got to start a new colony all by themselves. So right now, every bumblebee you see is a queen. So, make sure you don't hurt those bumblebees, because that's the rest of the bumblebees for the rest of the year depend on these guys. So they've got a big job. They've got to start the colony by themselves. So they need abundant forage, lots of pollen, lots of nectar that is easy to get. And that's exactly what redbud supplies. And then I saw a monarch. Actually, I saw two monarchs foraging on Monarch's Delight. This is all within 20 minutes. This was 2014, and I was very happy because I'd gone all of 2013 without seeing a single monarch. That was the low point of the monarch population in the East. Only 3.6% of the monarchs left compared to 1976. And this was June. It was early on. Monarchs don't come up the East Coast that early most years. So I was encouraged. Maybe the monarchs weren't going to disappear after all. Why were they there? Well, they had Monarch's Delight, but they also had another milkweed. I think it's purple milkweed, which means they had nectar, but they also had their host plant, everything they needed so that they could reproduce. Do you know where I was? I was on the High Line in the middle of Manhattan. The High Line is a renovated, elevated railroad that was abandoned for decades. Somebody went up and saw that there were some native plants growing up there. So they said, well, let's make this a tourist destination. And they did. 30 feet above the taxis, right in the middle of Manhattan. There's this strip of boardwalk with 3 feet of native plants. It's enormously popular. More than 1 million people visit the High Line every single year. There's the Monarch's Delight I was staring at. There's Rick Dark. He was always after me to go see the beautiful plants on the High Line. I'm not much of a city boy, so I dragged my feet. And also, I didn't think anything would be able to find and colonize these plants. I didn't care how pretty they were. Seeing a plant with nothing using it is actually depressing to me. Well, he finally did get me there, and I was completely wrong. There was all kinds of life forms on the High Line. Amazingly enough, somebody's finished a study of all the bees using the High Line now, the native bees. There are over 30 species of bees they've recorded there. So they are finding this little teeny strip of nature in the middle of Manhattan. And it convinces me that if thoughtful native plantings can bring life back to the middle of Manhattan, we can do this anywhere. We can do it absolutely anywhere. There are 4 things we need to think about, though, if we're going to succeed in a big way. We do need to succeed in a big way. And one of them is we've got to reduce the area we've got in lawn, because we got way too much area in lawn, more than 40 million acres. That's a 2005 statistic, by the way. Who knows what it is today? 40 million acres is bigger than in all of New England, dedicated to an ecological dead space. It's a status symbol. And, I get it that we humans need status symbols, but we can have less of it. Let's cut the area of lawn in half. The lawn we keep can still be manicured. We can still be good citizens, but let's put plants in the other half. And if we replant half the area that's now in lawn, we can create a new national park. And if we do it at home, we can call it Homegrown National Park. It'll be 20 million acres in size. How big's that? That's bigger than the Adirondacks, plus Yellowstone, plus Yosemite, plus Grand Tetons, Canyonlands, Mount Rainier, North Cascades, Badlands National Park, Olympic National Park, Sequoia National Park, plus the Grand Canyon, plus Denali, which is huge, plus the Great Smoky Mountains. Add up all those parks, still less than 20 million acres. So we will have the biggest national park in the country. What do you get when you put a park at home? You get the opportunity for developing a personal relationship with the natural world at your own time, your own pace. Maybe you had one as a child, but you've lost it. Time to get to know nature again. And you can do it while you're avoiding crowds. If you go to a real national park, there are millions of people there. That's the main feature that you're going to see. It's also free. There's no admission fee. It's never closed, no matter what pandemic comes down the pike. No travel hassles. You get to experience the natural world alone. And I don't know how you're going to develop a personal relationship not mediated by anybody else unless you are alone. This is particularly important for our poor kids. Richard Lewis says they're suffering from nature deficit disorder. So we're trying, we get 30 kids, put them on a bus with a teacher, and they drive for an hour and they walk around a natural area. Teacher tells them not to touch anything. Then they get back on the bus and they go home. And, I'm sure that's better than nothing. But what they've really experienced was 30 other kids and a teacher telling them not to touch anything. If they have some part of the natural world at home, right in their yard, all they have to do is go outside alone, no parental supervision. Let them develop that relationship the way they want to, which is so important because they are the future stewards of the planet. And if they don't have a relationship with what they're supposed to be stewarding, if they don't care about it, they're going to be lousy stewards. And maybe they'll learn how to hunt lizards. I'm learning this from my own granddaughter, Zoe, who lives in Hawaii on a very modest piece of nature. It's a tiny piece of lawn and a hedge. But there are anole lizards there. And she discovered that and sent me this picture. This is how you hunt a lizard. You get on the ground, you cover yourself with leaves and sticks so the lizard doesn't see you coming. Then you crawl very slowly towards the lizard. No smiling. This is serious business. You sneak up to the lizard, you catch the lizard, you put it in an aquarium, and then you take care of it. You learn how to steward the natural world. You've got that personal relationship with that piece of the natural world. Now, I don't think Zoe's going to be crawling on the ground in her best dress, catching lizards the rest of her life. I don't think. She sent me this picture recently, so maybe she will be. But I guarantee she's going to remember catching lizards in Hawaii the rest of her life. And I also guarantee this is going to help her be a good steward of the planet. If you want your kids to do more than catch lizards, get Nancy Stranisti's book called Nature Play at Home. Dozens of examples of how to expose your kids to the natural world right where they live. And if you want to join Homegrown National Park, go to our new website, homegrownnationalpark.org, and get yourself on the map. This is our attempt at social media to reach beyond the choir. What you're going to do is you're going to put your information of where you live and how much area you're going to take out of lawn. And it will light up where you live in your county. You'll get to see other people. When you're lit up, you've got a little lightning bug there. Other people in your county will light up. You get to see who else is doing this. And the object is to encourage people all over the country to do this till we reach our 20 million acre goal. And if we exceed that, we'll just keep going because there's a lot of acreage out there that needs to be restored. Oh, by the way, it doesn't cost anything, and we're not using your data for whatever you use data for. Okay, we're going to shrink the lawn. What plants should we put in the area of lawn we take out? Well, some of them are going to have to be what I'm calling keystone plants. Remember the Roman arch? There's the Roman arch. The keystone is the stone in the middle of that arch. And if you take the keystone out, your arch collapses. Well, if you take a keystone plant out of the local food web, your food web's going to collapse because the keystone plants are making most of the food. Just 5% of our native plants are making 75% of the caterpillar food that drives those food webs. 14% of our native plants are making 90% of the caterpillar food that drives those food webs, which means 85% of our native plants aren't doing all that much. They're contributing somewhat, but not that much. Think of the keystone plants in your yard. If you're building an ecological house, the keystone plants are the 2x4s of that house. They're essential, or the house isn't going to stand up. You can't build a house out of wallpaper. You're not done when you put in your keystone plants because you don't build a house just out of 2x4s either. But they are essential. The question no longer is simply, are natives better than non-natives? On average, they certainly are. But there are a lot of natives that aren't contributing that much. So let's focus on the really productive ones until we get in better shape. They're going to be better than the benign plants and much better than the ecologically destructive plants. Those, the Bradford pears of the world that are ecologically castrating all the natural land around us. It's biological pollution. I get an email once in a while from somebody saying, don't you know that ginkgos, ginkgo biloba from Asia, actually grew in North America 7 million years ago? That makes them native. That means we can plant them and then everything will be great. Well, yes, I do know that ginkgos grew in North America 7 million years ago. We can argue about whether that makes them native today, but I'm not going to have that argument because that's not the metric anymore. It's not whether they're native or not. It's whether they're doing anything or not. What's a ginkgo contributing to your local food web? Nothing. I don't care if it grew on the moon 7 million years ago. It makes 0 species of caterpillars. So it's there, but it's not contributing. What's contributing more than anything else? In 84% of the counties of North America, it is oaks. 557 species of caterpillars just in the mid-Atlantic states on oaks, and over 950 species nationwide. No other plant genus comes close to that. So here's the role of keystone oaks. The keystone oaks are playing in our yard here. Remember, I've taken pictures of 1,052 species of moths in my yard. Haven't gotten to the butterflies yet. That, by the way, is more species of moths than all the species of birds in all of North America. Out of the 1,052 species of moths, 924 have known host plants. Of those 924, 275 species are using oaks. Now, we've got 69 genera of native woody plants on our property, and only one of them is Quercus, the oaks. And we've got hundreds of genera of herbaceous plants. So oaks represent less than 1.5% of our woody plant diversity, and way less than 1% of our total plant diversity. But they're supporting at least 30% of our moss species diversity. So imagine what would happen to the diversity in our property if we took the oaks away. That's the role of a keystone plant. How do you find out what your keystone plants are? You go to Native Plant Finder, the National Wildlife Federation website, put in your zip code, and the ranked list of both woody and herbaceous plants will pop up for your county. This is what the list will look like. I stopped because I ran out of room. They're much bigger than this, but oaks are going to be number one in most places. Native cherries, native willows, blueberries are always high. Notice I say native, native, native. If I go to the nursery and say, I want to buy a cherry, they're going to sell me an ornamental cherry from Asia. If I say I want to buy a willow, they'll sell me a weeping willow from Turkey. If I ask for a birch, I'm liable to get a European birch or a maple. I might get a Japanese maple. You've got to specify that you want a native member of these native genera, because if you get non-native members, it's going to reduce caterpillar use by 65%. We have done that experiment. Here are the top herbaceous plants: solidago, various aster genera, particularly perennial sunflowers. Just with those three, not only are you going to support a lot of caterpillars, but you're also going to support at least 40 species of the specialist bees that can only reproduce on the pollen of these plants. If you don't have those in your yard, that's 40 species of bees that won't be there either. Okay, we're going to shrink the lawn. We're going to put in keystone plants, invite a lot of insects to our yard, and then we're going to kill them with our security light, which of course is not the goal. There's a lot of recent research out that is suggesting that, very convincingly, by the way, that light pollution at night is one of the major causes of insect decline. These are all the ways that lights kill insects. We have to turn around this insect decline. It's not something that we can tolerate. Losing our insects is just not an option. So if we can turn that around by simply turning off our lights, this is good news to me. I mean, what could be easier? Flick a switch. But I know what you're going to say. Well, I can't turn the light out over my garage because the bad man will come. Okay, put a motion sensor on it so it only turns on when the bad man does come. And the first thing you're going to notice is that the bad man doesn't come very often. If you don't want to do that, take the white bulb out of your security light and put in a yellow bulb. A yellow LED bulb is the best, because yellow wavelengths are much less attractive to nocturnal insects than white wavelengths. If we were to switch out our white bulbs for yellow LED bulbs overnight, we would save billions of insects and billions of dollars too, because of course LEDs are much more energy efficient. Okay, we're going to shrink the lawn. We're going to put in keystone plants. We're going to turn out our lights. Then we're going to invite Mosquito Joe to come and kill all our insects. Again, not the goal. Mosquito Joe is a booming business around the country. He's undoing everything I've been talking about for the last 15 years. And he'll say, well, it's okay because this is a natural product. It is a natural product. It's pyrethroids made from chrysanthemums. But cyanide is a natural product too, made from apricot pits. So that's not a good argument. But he's also going to say, well, this only kills mosquitoes, and that's not even close to true. Maybe you followed the news last fall during the monarch migration. Huge monarch kills from mosquito fogging. Hundreds of monarchs dead. It kills all the insects it comes in contact with. And he says, well, I'll say, you don't kill mosquitoes you don't control mosquitoes in the adult stage. You have to control them in the larval stage. In order to control mosquitoes in the adult stage, you have to kill 90% of them. Mosquito Joe only kills about 10% of the mosquitoes. So he's not even close to controlling the mosquito population. And that's why he has to keep coming back and charging you a lot of money. So you're paying a lot of money for something that doesn't work. The way you control mosquitoes is in the larval stage. You get a bucket, and people say, how big's the bucket? It doesn't matter how big the bucket is. The bigger the better, I guess. But fill it full of water. Put some straw or hay in the bucket and let it ferment for a couple of days. You're building up the diatoms and the algae that's what mosquito larvae eat. That becomes irresistible to adult mosquitoes who are going to lay their eggs. So they'll lay their eggs in your bucket. Then you put in a mosquito dunk. You get this at the hardware store. This is Bacillus thuringiensis. It's a natural bacterium that only kills aquatic dipteran. The only aquatic dipteran in your bucket here is a mosquito. So you kill the mosquitoes, and only the mosquitoes. If there's a dragonfly in there, it won't hurt it. If your dog licks it or the bird drinks it, it's not going to hurt it a bit. So much cheaper, targeted, and it works. Fourth thing we need to do is to develop landscapes that allow caterpillars to complete their development. And this is turning out to be really, really important. Something we're just starting to think about. I live in Chester County, Pennsylvania, where oaks support 511 species of caterpillars. A few of them, like the polyphemus moth, complete their development on the tree. The caterpillar eats the leaves, then it spins a cocoon and hangs from the branch, then it emerges as an adult, then it does it all again. I wish everything did that, but most things don't do that. It doesn't matter what the tree is. The caterpillars develop on the tree and then drop from it. And they wiggle their way beneath the ground and spin a cocoon or pupate underground, or spin a cocoon in the leaf litter that is under the tree. And that's the problem. We have no leaf litter under the tree. We are far too neat for that. This is the way we landscape everywhere. We know that. And the ground is mowed and trampled and compacted to the point where the caterpillar can't wiggle beneath the ground. So this becomes an ecological trap. The moths come in, lay their eggs, caterpillars develop, they drop down, and they die. I am convinced this is another major cause of insect declines. And of course, the cement landscape is even less of a viable option. This is what most people do. You have a tree in a yard. Nobody's measured the survivorship of caterpillars in a situation like this. We were going to do that last summer, but the COVID said no. But I guarantee it's higher in a situation like this, where you have a tree, maybe a layered landscape, a dogwood, a azalea, ferns, ground cover. The caterpillar drops down to a safe site. The ground is not compacted. They can easily get below the surface of the soil. They can spin a cocoon in the leaf litter. They're not going to be mowed. They're not going to be trampled. Much higher survivorship. This is where you can do your spring ephemeral gardening. This is how you shrink the lawn. You put beds around your trees. If you've got lawn going right up to your tree, that's a missed opportunity. Safe site for those caterpillars. This is where you can use your ground covers. Things like wild ginger or mayapple or foam flower or ferns, great ground cover. This is a hotel in Athens, Georgia. These are red maples. Any caterpillar developing on these red maples can fall down and complete their development in the firm here, even though this is the middle of a city. We can do much better underneath our trees. Another grad student, Desiree Narango, she's a former grad student, did wonderful work with chickadees in the suburbs of Washington, D.C., and her results suggest there's actually room for compromise in our plant choices. She compared the sustainability of chickadee populations in landscapes dominated by native plants versus landscapes dominated by introduced plants. When they were dominated by introduced plants, they produced 75% fewer caterpillars. So right away, you've reduced the amount of food for the chickadees by 75%. Those landscapes were 60% less likely to have breeding chickadees at all. So there were nest boxes up in all these suburban yards, but the chickadees would come and say, there's not enough food here. We're not even going to try. If they did try, those nests contained 1.5 fewer eggs. They were 29% less likely to survive at all. If they did survive, they produced 1.2 fewer fledglings, and maturation was delayed by 1.5 days. And if you put all that together in a population growth model as a function of the percentage of non-native woody plant biomass in your yard, from none to 100%, this is what you get. Looked at woody plant biomass because that's where chickadees are foraging. This dotted line is replacement rate. It's the rate at which the population makes babies. They make babies at the same rate that adults die, which means the population is sustainable. It's not growing, but it's not shrinking either. If you make more babies than adults die, you've got a growing population. But if you make fewer, you have a shrinking population, an unsustainable population. And right here is where those lines overlap, generously speaking, or intersect, I should say. So that means you can have to 30% of your woody plant biomass as non-native plants without destroying the local food web, as long as 70% of your woody plant biomass is native. So this is the area of compromise that I'm talking about. You can have your ginkgo, you can have your crepe myrtle, you can have your boxwood, no invasive plants, no calorie pear, no burning bush. But it's good news to me, because if my message was you can't have any non-native plants, nobody would listen. Everybody loves their non-native plants. It's not the presence of non-native plants that destroys food webs, though. It's the absence of native plants. If we put more of these into the landscape, we can tolerate our non-natives. Can natives be used in formal designs? Of course they can. This is a design by Lynn O'Shaughnessy. I just got this as an email the other day. This is taken from a drone. It's a big garden. You can't get more formal than that, but every single plant in that landscape is a native plant. Formality is a function of the design. It's not a function of the plants in the design. Our native plants are used in formal designs all the time in Europe. And I guess that's okay, because they're non-native plants over there. Can we get a pollinator garden into a typical suburban yard like this without offending anybody? Of course we can. Just put a little fence around it. Formalizes it. Number of species in the area helping a number of native bees is not very big. We could make it bigger, but it's obviously not a pile of weeds. How about this design? Much bigger? How much life is supported here versus how much life is supported here? It seems like a no-brainer. This is a Drew Latham design, by the way. Can municipalities help us live with nature? Yes, they can, and more are doing it. Minnesota is one of the first, might have been the first, a cost-sharing program to encourage homeowners to replace some or all of their lawn with appropriate Minnesota prairie plants. They called it the Lawn to Legume program, very popular. Pennsylvania, I just learned about this. It's a young program, only 2 years old. You can get up to $5,000 per acre to convert your yard from lawn to something that's more productive. Florida is paying residents, an island off of Florida is paying residents to allow burrowing owls, listed species, to burrow in the front yard. If you have a burrowing owl, they pay you to allow them to do that. This is the way the Endangered Species Act should have been written, with carrots rather than sticks. Everybody would want an endangered species because you get paid to take care of it. You know about the bounty that was that Missouri had on calorie pears, and Fayetteville, Arkansas still does. You take out a calorie pear, you get a free tree replacement. Even public utilities are giving people $100 coupons to put in water efficient plants where there's not enough water, and take out those non-natives that use too much water. And of course, the lawn conversion programs in the far west that have been very successful, particularly California, up to $2 per square foot rebate if you take out that thirsty lawn and put in appropriate xeric plantings. I think we made 3 missteps in the early years of conservation. The first misstep is, for some reason, we don't think nature or we think nature is optional. We don't think it's essential. And if it's optional, that means when push comes to shove, nature always takes a back seat. We always think the things that are essential will go first. And there's always a shortage of resources. So nature's always taking a back seat. I went to the Cincinnati Zoo before the virus broke out, and there was this wall-sized poster here that epitomizes, in my opinion, what our society's view of conservation is. We want to save wildlife so the future generations can enjoy it. It was Teddy Roosevelt's reasoning for starting the national park system. They're magnificent places, and we want everybody to be able to enjoy them in the future. And that's a fine reason, but it suggests that nature's just entertainment. No wonder we don't think it's essential. It's more than entertainment. We need to save nature so that we have future generations. It's a little bit more urgent. We've also assumed that humans and nature cannot coexist. Now, restricting conservation efforts to untouched areas, we're going to fail, because that means those areas are too small and too disconnected from each other to sustain the species that we need. David Quammen has an excellent analogy between a Persian rug and an ecosystem. This is a functional Persian rug. That is not 71 Persian rugs. That's 71 rug fragments, none of which are acting like a Persian rug. And this is what we've done to our ecosystems. The UN designates biosphere reserves as places of ecological significance. I hate that language because it suggests there are places on planet Earth with no ecological significance. Not so. Every square inch of the planet has ecological significance, including our yards, including our corporate landscapes, even including much of our agriculture. So we need to glue our rug back together again. We need to put the plants back, not just to build biological corridors so plants and animals can move back and forth between viable habitats. We need to recreate viable habitats where we live, where we work, where we play, and where we farm. In other words, we're going to start to coexist with nature for the first time. Our third misstep was to leave Earth stewardship to just a few specialists, a few conservation biologists, a few ecologists. We didn't see it as an inherent responsibility of everybody on the planet. But I don't know why, because every person on the planet depends entirely on the quality of Earth's ecosystems. So why wouldn't everybody have the responsibility of good Earth stewardship? Stan Rushworth, a Cherokee elder, once said that the Western settler mindset is, I have rights. The mindset of indigenous people is, I have obligations. You're not born with these mindsets, you're taught them. We're good at teaching this one. We've been terrible at teaching this one to our kids and to our peers. Terrible at teaching that everybody has an obligation for good Earth stewardship. It doesn't mean you have to save biodiversity for a living, but you can save it where you live. And if you do, it empowers you. Right now, so many of us feel powerless. You know, what can one person do that will make a difference? Well, one person can shrink their lawn. One person can take out their invasive plants. They can put in keystone plants and build a pollinator garden. One person can do that. One person can revitalize their little piece of the earth. And it shrinks the problem down to something that's manageable for each one of us. Don't think about the entire planet's problems. Just think about the piece of the earth that you can influence. If you own property, it's obvious. That's where you start. If you don't own property, help somebody who does. Help a land conservancy. Help a park or preserve. They're all underfunded. They're all understaffed. They will love you as a volunteer. So as property owners or as volunteers, each one of us has the power, and we certainly have the responsibility to fix dead landscapes like this. Whether or not we determine to do so is going to determine nature's fate, and then ultimately our own fate. So I think I've convinced my grandkids that you are nature's best hope. I hope I've convinced you as well. Thanks very much. I'm
Doug,
done.
thank you so much. Well, I was looking for the hand clapping icon on Zoom,
okay.
but I don't see it.
Yeah, I can never find it either.
Somebody found it. Thank you. Thank you, Emily. Folks, please go ahead and put your questions, comments into the chat. You can do it in the Whova app. You can do it in Zoom. We have a couple questions, one of which is, how did Cindy successfully clear all the invasives?
You know, there's a number of ways to do it. Cindy will not use herbicide for a bunch of reasons. So she didn't. She cut them repeatedly, cut them, pulled them, cut them, pulled them, cut them, pulled them. I do use herbicide in a limited way. I don't spray because I always hit non-targets. But for some of the big guys, I saw it at the base and then paint the stump with an oil-based herbicide so it gets into the roots. If you don't kill the roots, you're doing it forever. So most of the work was done literally by just a lot of labor. I did cut and paint some of the bigger guys. once you get rid of the big ones, then you're only dealing with the small ones that seed in that year, and that's much more manageable. And then you really can pull them out by the roots. But there's no minimizing the amount of work it is. By bringing in these invasive plants, we've just created a nightmare. But it's not one we should give up on, because leaving them there creates a bigger nightmare. It's just less obvious.
Another question is, so you mentioned an owlet, a stowaway, and the hackberry emperor, and that they came back to your property about 2 months and 1 year and 4 years. Where did they come from? So was there a source somewhere near you, or how did that work?
Of course, I don't know all the sources near me. I don't know where the Canadian owlet came from. I still don't know where there's any meadow rue around here. When I got the goldenrod, the Biden's Aristosa seeds, there were goldenrod stowaways there. That was 14 miles away. Maybe they came 14 miles. We've got the my brain is fried here. We put in pawpaws to get the zebra swallowtail. The closest population I know of is 29 miles away, and it took 9 years for that one to come, but it did. Insects really do move around. They get up and they fly. I have caught a species from South America twice on our property that just regularly flies up here. So they really do get around. What you want to do is put in what they're looking for. They find it through smell, through chemicals in the air, and when they're flying by, they say, "Oh, that's what I'm looking for," and they'll come down. Who knows where they came from? But that's how isolated plants can get colonized. So one of the things we're showing is that it really doesn't matter where you are. The insects are pretty good at finding them. When they're coming from a long way away, it's going to take them longer, but if you put in enough of what they're looking for, then they stay and you can have a viable population.
I'm checking various devices here, Doug. How do you recommend converting a lawn? Would you use herbicide to kill the grass?
That's the fastest way. You can smother the grass with black plastic, with cardboard. That can take a while. But one of the ones, my son called me up a couple years ago. He brought a new house, and in the fall he said, "Dad, I've got too many leaves. What do I do with the leaves?" And I said, "Put them in your flower beds." And he said, "I don't have enough flower beds." I said, "Exactly. That's how you create a new flower bed. Rake your leaves and really pile them up in an area of lawn you want to take out. And that does a good job of smothering that lawn. Then you can plant right through it. It loosens the soil over the winter. It adds nutrients and organic matter to the soil. So, if I had to choose a method, I think the worst way is to actually dig up the sod and remove it, because you're taking an awful lot of soil and organic matter with you when you do that, and it's a lot of labor too. On the other hand, if you try to plant right through grass, particularly seeds, if you're going to make a meadow and just throw some prairie seeds out there when it's all grass, that's going to fail, because the grass is really competitive, and you often need bare mineral soil for a lot of these seeds to germinate. So getting rid of the grass is highly recommended.
We have a question here about native nightshade. Could you possibly talk more about native nightshade, since they are so valuable?
Well, it's a solanaceous plant. Don't eat it. It's called deadly nightshade for a reason, but it supports several solanaceous specialists, including some of our sphinx moths and some noctuids. I'm not sure what else you want me to say about it. It's one of the literally thousands of species of plants that run our ecosystem. So.
Doug, if you don't mind, I myself had a question. You mentioned that of the 1,052 species of caterpillars and moths that you found on your property, 924 of them have known host plants. So the other, 100 and some, it's still unknown what the host plant is.
That's right. We have over 12,000 species of moths and butterflies in the US, and we only know the host plants for approaching 800 of them. 8,000 of them. So, there are thousands of moths. We don't know what they're eating. And that's because you get these moths at a light at night. We don't know what they were eating as a caterpillar. I am still hoping to come up with a technique for figuring out what an adult moth ate. If you grind it up and get the DNA of something, who knows? The trouble is when they go through the pupation stage, it really rids the body of anything that was there in the larval stage. But it would be very helpful to know what all these caterpillars are eating. So when I say we've got more than 100, we don't know what they're eating. Some of those are eating oaks too. So that number is going to be higher than what I'm reporting. It's just that we don't know what they're eating yet. Still a lot to learn. So when you find a caterpillar, what you'd have to do is rear it through to an adult, and then you know what it was eating as the caterpillar, and that's how we get new host records.
Wow. So it's only known for about 3/4 then.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Wow. So to folks that are attending here, Katie has put an inspiring comment into the chat if anyone wants to read it. She's a young person who this is a very, very important topic to her.
Good. Young people are great because you people are the future. I'm usually talking to people even older than me. That's hard to do too. So
checking around here, Doug, it looks like we have many comments of thanks, which
you're welcome. I love talking to people who care.
There's a lot of people who care on here. Someone says, I wish your words could reach everyone on the planet.
Working on it.
Definitely. Yep. Any further questions, folks? And I'm going to go ahead and just, I'll save the chat and I will send them to Doug all as an email so that he can see all those comments in there.
Thank you. Well, thanks for listening, everybody.
Thank you so very much. This is wonderful. And we will also be reaching people with the recording of this wonderful presentation. So much appreciated.
All right. Well, enjoy the rest of your weekend.
All right. Good night, everybody.
Bye-bye.